The basement of Mount Calvary Baptist Church had always been off-limits to teenagers, but 17-year-old Marcus Henderson had never been one to follow rules strictly, especially not when those rules seemed arbitrary, handed down by church elders who remembered a time when the basement held secrets they'd rather keep buried. It was a sweltering August afternoon in Millbrook, Georgia, when Marcus descended the creaking wooden stairs, flashlight in hand. The youth group had been tasked with cleaning the church in preparation for the annual homecoming service, and someone needed to retrieve the folding chairs stored in the basement. The other kids had scattered to easier tasks, leaving Marcus alone with the musty darkness below. The beam of his flashlight cut through cobwebs and dust motes, illuminating stacks of hymnals, Christmas decorations, and furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved since the Clinton administration. But it was what he found behind the old piano that would change everything. A loose floorboard creaked under his weight, and when Marcus knelt to examine it, he discovered it wasn't just loose, it was deliberately movable. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth and protected from the Georgia humidity, was a metal box about the size of a shoebox. Inside that box were photographs, documents, and a leather-bound journal that would resurrect questions the town of Millbrook had spent 18 years trying to forget. The returned detective James Mitchell had sworn he'd never come back to Millbrook. The town held too many ghosts, too many memories of the man he used to be before cynicism, and 15 years of working Atlanta homicide had worn away his faith like water over stone. But here he was, standing in the parking lot of Mount Calvary Baptist Church, staring at the building where his life had changed forever. The call had come from Sheriff Patricia Dawson, his old high school classmate who'd somehow managed to keep both her sanity and her optimism despite 20 years in law enforcement in rural Georgia. "James, I need you to see something," she'd said, her voice tight with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "It's about Pastor Williams." Pastor Elijah Williams. The name hit James like a physical blow, even after all these years. The man who had baptized James and his younger sister Sarah in the Chattahoochee River on a warm Sunday in April 1987. The man who had died 3 days later under circumstances that never quite made sense, no matter how many times the official story was repeated. James had been 19 then, home from his first year at Georgia State, still carrying the faith his grandmother had instilled in him, and the hope that he might follow Pastor Williams into ministry. Sarah had been 12. All knees and elbows and endless questions about God and heaven and why bad things happen to good people. Now James was 37, his faith as dried up as autumn leaves, and Sarah had been dead for 10 years, killed by a drunk driver while driving home from her job as a social worker in Savannah. The irony wasn't lost on him that she'd kept her faith right up until the end, while he'd lost his the day they lowered Pastor Williams into the ground. Sheriff Dawson was waiting for him in the church parking lot, looking exactly like what she was, a competent law enforcement officer who'd seen enough of the world's darkness to be cautious, but not enough to be broken by it. She was tall and solid, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. "Appreciate you coming, James," she said, extending her hand. "I know this isn't easy." "What's this about, Pat? Your message was pretty cryptic." She gestured toward the church. "Better if you see for yourself. Marcus Henderson found something in the basement yesterday. The kid's shaken up pretty bad, but he had sense enough to bring it to me instead of posting it on social media." They walked toward the church, past the familiar oak trees that had provided shade for church picnics, and the small cemetery where James's grandmother rested alongside 3 generations of Millbrook's faithful. The church itself looked smaller than he remembered, its white clapboard siding in need of paint, the steeple slightly askew from years of Georgia weather. "Marcus is waiting inside with his grandmother," Patricia continued. "Adelaide Henderson. You remember her?" James nodded. Adelaide Henderson had been one of Pastor Williams's most devoted parishioners, a woman who'd raised 6 children on a domestic worker's salary, and somehow managed to contribute more to the church's collection plate than families with 10 times her income. Inside, the church smelled exactly as James remembered: old wood, furniture polish, and the lingering scent of decades of Sunday dinners eaten on paper plates in the fellowship hall. Adelaide Henderson sat in the front pew, her arm around a tall, lanky teenager who had her same intelligent eyes and stubborn jawline. "James Mitchell," Adelaide said, rising to embrace him. "Look at you, all grown up and important. Your grandmother would be so proud." James accepted the hug, feeling 17 again under Adelaide's knowing gaze. "Ms. Adelaide, I'm sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances. Some circumstances got to be met head-on, she replied firmly. Marcus, show Detective Mitchell what you found. The teenager looked up with eyes that held the particular combination of fear and excitement that came with stumbling onto something significant. He reached into a backpack at his feet and withdrew a metal box that looked like it had been well cared for despite its age. I found it under a loose floorboard in the basement, Marcus said, behind the old piano. It was wrapped up real good, like someone wanted to make sure it stayed dry. Patricia took the box and set it on the pew between them. Go ahead, James. Open it. Inside were perhaps 20 photographs, some in color, but most in black and white. A leather-bound journal with EW embossed on the cover, several folded documents that looked official, and at the bottom, a small wooden cross on a leather cord that James recognized immediately. His hands shook as he lifted the cross. Pastor Williams had worn it every day, claimed it had been carved by his grandfather from wood taken from a tree that had provided shade for secret prayer meetings during slavery times. James had admired it as a child, and Pastor Williams had promised that someday, when James was ordained, it would be his. James? Patricia's voice seemed to come from very far away. You okay? He set the cross down carefully and picked up one of the photographs. It showed Pastor Williams baptizing a family in the Chattahoochee River, a man, a woman, and 3 children. The date written on the back in Pastor Williams' careful handwriting was April 26, 1987, 3 days before he died. But it wasn't James and Sarah in the photograph. It was a family he didn't recognize, a white family, which was unusual for Mount Calvary, a historically black church in a town where integration was still more theory than practice in 1987. Do you recognize them? Patricia asked. James studied the faces. The father was tall and thin with prematurely gray hair. The mother was petite with kind eyes. The children appeared to be around 10, 8, and 6 years old. There was something familiar about the man's face, but James couldn't place it. I don't think so, he said finally. But Pastor Williams baptized a lot of people. Not all of them were church members. Adelaide cleared her throat. That's Thomas Brennan and his family, she said quietly. They came to Pastor Williams the week before he died. Said they wanted to be baptized but couldn't do it at their own church. The name hit James like cold water. Thomas Brennan. Even in 1987, everyone in Millbrook knew that name. Brennan had been the town's most successful businessman, owner of the lumber mill that employed half the county and the bank that held mortgages on most of the homes. He'd also been a deacon at First Baptist, the largest white church in town, and rumored to be considering a run for the state legislature. Why would Brennan want to be baptized by Pastor Williams? James asked. Adelaide's expression darkened. That's what we all wondered. But Pastor Williams, he never turned anyone away who came to him with a sincere heart. Said baptism was between a soul and God, not between a person and the color of their skin. James picked up the journal and opened it to a random page. Pastor Williams's handwriting was as neat and precise as always, but the content made James's blood run cold. April 24, 1987. Thomas came to see me again today. He's frightened, and I understand why. What he's discovered about the mill's finances. If it's true, it explains so much about why families in the bottoms have been getting sick. I told him I would help him do the right thing, but he has to be the one to step forward. A man can't run from his conscience forever. The bottoms. James remembered the neighborhood well, a collection of small houses downstream from the lumber mill, where most of Mount Calvary's congregation lived. In the late 1980s, there had been an unusual number of cancer cases there, but the state health department had concluded there was no environmental cause. He flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry, documenting meetings with Thomas Brennan, growing concern about contamination from the lumber mill, and Pastor Williams's growing conviction that someone needed to speak out. The final entry was dated April 28, 1987. Tomorrow I baptize the Brennan family in the river. Thomas says he's ready to make things right, that the baptism will give him the strength to do what needs to be done. I pray he's right. I've given him copies of everything, the documents, the test results, the photographs. If something happens to me, he'll have to be the one to bring this to light. Lord, give us both courage. Pastor Williams had died that night. The official story was that he'd suffered a heart attack while walking home from church. He was 43 years old with no history of heart problems. James looked up to find Patricia, Adelaide, and Marcus all watching him intently. Ms. Adelaide, he said carefully. What happened to the Brennan family after Pastor Williams died? The old woman's face was grim. They left town about a week later. Said Thomas had gotten a job offer in Atlanta that was too good to pass up. Never saw any of them again. And the mill? Kept operating until 1995, when Thomas sold it to some company out of Alabama. By then, of course, the cancer cluster in the bottoms had gotten too big to ignore. EPA came in, found contamination in the groundwater, started a cleanup that's still going on today. James felt the familiar weight of injustice settling in his chest. How many people got sick? 47 cases of cancer between 1985 and 1995, Patricia said quietly. Mostly lung and liver. 16 deaths including... She didn't finish the sentence, but James knew. Including his grandmother, who had lived in the bottoms her entire life and had died of liver cancer in 1994, still maintaining her faith even as the disease consumed her body. Why wasn't this investigation reopened when the contamination was discovered? James asked. Patricia and Adelaide exchanged a look. Because, Adelaide said slowly, by then everyone who might have known what really happened was either dead or gone, and the people with power in this town, well, they had their reasons for letting sleeping dogs lie. Unraveling the truth. That evening James sat in his motel room, the same Millbrook Inn where traveling salesmen and out-of-town relatives had stayed for decades, spreading the contents of the metal box across the small table by the window. The photographs, documents, and journal entries painted a picture that was becoming clearer and more disturbing with each piece of evidence. Pastor Williams had been more than just a minister. He'd been conducting his own investigation into the environmental contamination that was making his parishioners sick. The documents in the box included water test results that had never been made public, photographs of illegal dumping behind the lumber mill, and what appeared to be internal company memos discussing the disposal of chemical waste. James's phone buzzed. Patricia. Learn anything new? She asked. Enough to know that Pastor Williams didn't die of natural causes. James replied. These documents. Pat, if this information had come out in 1987, it would have shut down the mill and probably sent several people to prison, including Thomas Brennan, especially Thomas Brennan. According to these memos, he knew about the contamination as early as 1985, but kept it quiet to avoid cleanup costs. We're talking about millions of dollars in potential liability. There was silence on the other end of the line. Pat, I'm here. Just thinking. James, I need to tell you something about the night Pastor Williams died. James set down the photograph he'd been studying. I'm listening. I was just a rookie deputy then, barely 6 months on the job. I was the one who responded to the call about his body being found. It was Mayor Caldwell who called it in. Said he'd been driving home late and saw Pastor Williams collapsed on Maple Street. James knew Maple Street. It was the main road through the bottoms, about half a mile from the church. What did you see when you got there? That's just it. I saw what I was supposed to see. A middle-aged black man who'd apparently suffered a heart attack. But James, I've been thinking about it for 18 years, and some things never made sense. Like what? Like the fact that Pastor Williams was wearing his good shoes, the ones he only wore on Sundays, on a Tuesday night. Like the fact that his car was still parked at the church but he was found half a mile away. Like the fact that he had dirt under his fingernails and his clothes were disheveled, as if he'd been in some kind of struggle. James felt his pulse quicken. Did you document any of this? I tried. But Sheriff Hartwell, he was the sheriff then, he shut down any questions real quick. Said it was obvious what had happened, and there was no point in putting the family through the trauma of an investigation when the cause of death was clear. Who was the coroner? Dr. Richard Caldwell? The mayor's brother? James closed his eyes. In small southern towns, especially in the 1980s, the web of relationships and mutual interests could make justice nearly impossible to achieve, particularly when the victim was black and the potential perpetrators were white and powerful. Pat, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Shoot. Do you think there are people in this town who would still want to keep this quiet? The pause was long enough to be an answer in itself. Mayor Caldwell is still mayor, Patricia said finally. His brother Richard is still the county coroner. The lumber mill may be gone, but the families who owned it and profited from it, they're still here, still powerful, still with a lot to lose if the truth comes out. What about Thomas Brennan? Any idea what happened to him? That's the thing, James. I did some checking this afternoon. Thomas Brennan died in a car accident in Atlanta in 1992. Single-car crash, late at night. No witnesses. His wife and kids moved to California after that. James felt a chill run down his spine. That's awfully convenient. Isn't it just? They were quiet for a moment, both understanding the implications of what they were discussing. James, I have to ask, are you sure you want to pursue this? I mean, I know what Pastor Williams meant to you, but stirring up 18-year-old secrets in a town like this, it could get complicated. James looked at the wooden cross lying on the table beside Pastor Williams' journal. He thought about his grandmother dying slowly and painfully from a cancer that might have been prevented if the truth had come out in 1987. He thought about all the families in the Bottoms who had lost loved ones, while the people responsible lived comfortable lives built on lies and cover-ups. Pat, how many of Pastor Williams' congregation are still alive? Maybe a dozen. Most have passed on or moved away. I want to talk to them. All of them. And I want to find out everything I can about what really happened the night he died. James, I became a cop to find the truth, Pat. Maybe I lost my faith somewhere along the way, but I never lost that. Pastor Williams died trying to protect his community. The least I can do is finish what he started. Patricia sighed. All right, but we do this carefully. If there really was a cover-up, and if the people responsible are still around, well, they've had 18 years to perfect their story. We're going to need more than old documents and suspicions. Then we better get started. Witnesses and memories. Adelaide Henderson lived in the same small house in the Bottoms where she'd raised her 6 children, a neat white frame structure with a front porch that had seen countless conversations, meals, and moments of community connection. When James arrived the next morning, she was waiting with coffee and the kind of breakfast that could fuel a person for a day of difficult conversations. I've been thinking all night about what you found in that box, she said, settling into her favorite chair with a cup of coffee that was probably 50% cream. And I keep coming back to something Pastor Williams said to me the week before he died. James had his notebook ready. After 15 years of detective work, he'd learned that the most important conversations often happened over kitchen tables, not in interrogation rooms. What did he say? He came by on a Wednesday evening. April 22nd, I remember because it was the night before my grandson's birthday. He seemed troubled, more troubled than I'd ever seen him. He said he was carrying a burden that was getting too heavy for one man to bear. Did he say what kind of burden? Adelaide shook her head. Not directly. But he asked me something strange. He asked if I trusted him enough to keep something safe for him, something that might be important someday. I said of course I would, but he never brought me anything. Do you think he was planning to give you those documents? Maybe. Or maybe he was just thinking out loud, trying to figure out who he could trust. Adelaide's expression grew sad. Pastor Williams was a careful man, James. He wouldn't have kept those documents unless he thought they were important. And he wouldn't have hidden them unless he thought someone might try to stop him from using them. James made notes as Adelaide talked, but part of his mind was working on the timeline. If Pastor Williams had been planning to turn over evidence of the contamination, and if certain people knew about it, Ms. Adelaide, do you remember anything unusual about the days right before Pastor Williams died? Anyone coming to see him who didn't usually visit? Any strange phone calls or conversations? The old woman was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the street where many of her neighbors had lived and died. There was something, she said finally. The Saturday before he died, I was at the church helping prepare for Sunday service. A car pulled up, a big black car, the kind important white folks drove back then. 2 men got out and went inside to talk to Pastor Williams. Did you recognize them? I didn't know their names, but I'd seen them around town. One was tall and thin with gray hair. Looked like he might be somebody's lawyer. The other was younger, stockier, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most folks in the Bottoms made in a month. James felt his pulse quicken. How long were they there? Maybe 20 minutes. But when they left, Pastor Williams looked like he'd seen a ghost. He was shaking, James. Actually shaking. I asked him if he was all right, and he just said that sometimes doing the right thing was the hardest thing in the world. Did he say anything else? Just that he was going to need to pray extra hard that week, and that if anything ever happened to him, he trusted God to make sure the truth came out eventually. James wrote down everything Adelaide remembered, knowing that 18-year-old memories could be unreliable, but sensing that her recollections had the ring of truth. He also made a note to research what lawyers and businessmen in Millbrook had driven black cars in 1987. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Adelaide rose to answer it, returning with a woman James vaguely recognized from his childhood. James, you remember Dolores Washington? She was in the choir with your grandmother. Dolores Washington was a small, neat woman in her 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She took a seat at Adelaide's kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee before getting to the point. Adelaide called me this morning and told me about what that boy found, she said without preamble. I've been carrying some secrets for 18 years, and I think it's time to let them go. James set down his pen. What kind of secrets, Mrs. Washington? The kind that keep you awake at night. Dolores took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. The Tuesday night Pastor Williams died. I was at the church late. I'd forgotten my purse after choir practice, and I went back to get it around 9 o'clock. James leaned forward. According to the official timeline, Pastor Williams had been found dead around 10:30 that night. Was Pastor Williams there when you arrived? He was in his office with someone. The lights were on, and I could hear voices through the door. But something about the conversation didn't sound right. What do you mean? Pastor Williams sounded upset, not angry, but scared maybe. And the other voice was louder, more aggressive. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was threatening. Did you see who he was talking to? Dolores nodded slowly. When I left, I went out the back door so I wouldn't disturb them. But I saw a car parked behind the church where it couldn't be seen from the road. Big black car, just like Adelaide described. James felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into place. Mrs. Washington, did you tell anyone about this at the time? The old woman's face showed a mixture of regret and old fear. I told Sheriff Hartwell the next day, after we heard about Pastor Williams' death. But he said I must have been mistaken about the timing, that the coroner had determined Pastor Williams died of natural causes while walking home alone. Did you believe him? I wanted to. It was easier to believe that than to think. She trailed off, shaking her head. Then to think what? Then to think that good Christian men might murder a pastor for trying to do the right thing. The weight of that statement settled over the kitchen like a shroud. James realized he was dealing with more than just a cold case. He was looking at a community that had spent 18 years living with the knowledge that justice had been denied and that the people responsible were still among them. Mrs. Washington, would you be willing to make an official statement about what you saw that night? She met his eyes steadily. James, I'm 74 years old. I've got grandchildren and great-grandchildren to think about. But I also know that Pastor Williams died trying to protect this community, and keeping quiet about it hasn't brought anyone peace. Is that a yes? That's a yes. It's time for the truth to come out, whatever the cost. Following the money, James spent the afternoon at the Millbrook courthouse, digging through public records with the tenacity that had made him a successful detective. Property transfers, business licenses, tax records, all the mundane documents that could reveal patterns invisible to casual observers. What he found painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond environmental contamination. The lumber mill had been owned by Brennan Industries, which was controlled by Thomas Brennan, but had several silent partners, whose names appeared in various business filings throughout the 1980s. Mayor Caldwell had been one of them. So had Dr. Richard Caldwell, Sheriff Hartwell, and 3 other prominent local businessmen. More interesting was what happened after Pastor Williams's death. Within 6 months, Brennan Industries had received 2 lucrative government contracts, one for timber sales from federal land, another for construction materials for a new county building project. The combined value was over $3 million, enough to offset any potential losses from environmental cleanup costs. James was making copies of the relevant documents when Patricia found him. "Learn anything interesting?" she asked, sliding into the chair across from him in the courthouse records room. "Enough to understand why Pastor Williams had to die," James said, showing her the business partnership documents. "Look at this. Half the town's power structure had a financial stake in keeping that mill operating." Patricia studied the papers. "This explains a lot about why the investigation was shut down so quickly. It gets worse. I found the records for the EPA cleanup that happened in the 90s. Guess who got the remediation contract? Please tell me it wasn't Caldwell Environmental Services, a company that didn't exist before 1995 and was owned by Richard Caldwell and 2 of the other mill partners." Patricia sat back in her chair. "So they profited from creating the problem and from cleaning it up. Classic corruption scheme. And anyone who might have exposed it in 1987 ended up dead of a convenient heart attack." James gathered the documents he'd copied. "Pat, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." "Okay." Is there anyone in the current power structure of this town that you trust completely? Anyone who wasn't connected to the mill or the cover-up? Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Judge Sarah Coleman, she said finally. She came here from Atlanta about 10 years ago, has no local connections, and she's got a reputation for being absolutely incorruptible. Why? Because if we're going to move forward with this, we're going to need someone in authority who can't be bought or intimidated. James, what exactly are you thinking? I'm thinking that 18 years is long enough for people to get comfortable, to think they're safe. I'm thinking that some of the people involved in this cover-up are still alive and still in positions of power. And I'm thinking that if we can build a strong enough case, we might be able to get justice not just for Pastor Williams, but for all the people who died because the truth was buried. Patricia looked at the stack of documents. That's a lot of thinking. What do you need from me? I need you to help me find the Brennan family. If Thomas is dead, maybe his wife or children know something. And I need you to help me figure out who was in that black car the night Pastor Williams died. The car Dolores Washington saw? And the one Adelaide saw at the church that Saturday. I'm betting it's the same car, and I'm betting if we can identify it, we can identify at least one of the people involved in the murder. Patricia nodded slowly. All right, but James, we need to be careful about who we talk to and who we trust. If you're right about this conspiracy, then some of the people we're investigating might still be dangerous. James thought about his grandmother, dying slowly and painfully while the people responsible for her illness lived comfortable lives. He thought about Pastor Williams, who had tried to speak truth to power and paid for it with his life. He thought about all the families who had lost loved ones to preventable cancers, while justice remained buried in a church basement. I understand the risks, Pat, but I also understand what happens when good people do nothing in the face of evil. Pastor Williams didn't back down, even when he knew it might cost him his life. I'm not going to dishonor his memory by backing down now. Secrets in Atlanta. The drive to Atlanta took 2 hours, time James used to think through the questions he wanted to ask Susan Brennan Morrison, formerly Susan Brennan, widow of Thomas Brennan and mother of the 3 children who had been baptized by Pastor Williams just days before his death. Patricia had tracked her down through public records and social media, a surprisingly difficult task for someone who seemed determined to maintain a low profile. Susan lived in a modest suburb north of Atlanta, worked as a school librarian, and had apparently never remarried after her husband's death in 1992. James found the house easily enough, a neat ranch-style home with a well-maintained garden and a mailbox that identified it as the Morrison residence. He sat in his car for a few minutes, gathering his thoughts and trying to decide how to approach a conversation that might be traumatic for the woman inside. The decision was made for him when Susan Morrison emerged from the house, clearly having seen his car. She was in her early 60s now, still petite as she'd been in the baptism photograph, but carrying herself with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust strangers. "Can I help you?" she asked, staying on her front porch rather than approaching his car. James got out slowly, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. "Mrs. Morrison, my name is James Mitchell. I'm a detective from Atlanta, but I grew up in Millbrook. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about something that happened there a long time ago." The woman's face went pale. "Millbrook?" "Yes, ma'am. About your family's time there in 1987, and about Pastor Elijah Williams." Susan Morrison looked around nervously, as if checking to see whether anyone was watching. I don't know what you're talking about." "Mrs. Morrison, I have a photograph of Pastor Williams baptizing you and your family in April of 1987. I also have documents that suggest your husband was trying to expose environmental contamination at his lumber mill when Pastor Williams was murdered." The word murdered hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the porch railing for support. "Please," James said gently, "I'm not here to cause you trouble. I'm here because I think Pastor Williams was killed to keep him quiet, and I think your husband might have been killed for the same reason." Susan Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then looked up and down the street again. "Not here," she said finally. "There's a coffee shop about 2 miles north on Highway 9. Meet me there in 20 minutes. So, the coffee shop was one of those generic chains that could have been anywhere in America, which was probably why Susan Morrison had chosen it. She was waiting in a corner booth when James arrived, hands wrapped around a coffee cup as if trying to draw warmth from it despite the August heat. "I've been expecting someone like you for 35 years, she said without preamble, as James sat down across from her. "Part of me is relieved it's finally happened." "Mrs. Morrison, Call me Susan, and before we start, I need you to understand something. My children don't know any of this. As far as they're concerned, their father was a successful businessman who died in a car accident. I'd like to keep it that way if possible." James nodded. "I understand. Can you tell me what really happened in Millbrook?" Susan took a sip of her coffee, her hands still shaking slightly. "Thomas wasn't a bad man, Detective Mitchell. He was weak maybe, and he made some terrible decisions, but he wasn't evil. Not like some of the others." "What others?" "The partners. The people who really controlled the mill and half the town. Thomas was just the front man, the acceptable face they put on their operations." "Who were they?" "Mayor Caldwell was the ringleader. His brother Richard was involved, along with Sheriff Hartwell and a few other local businessmen. They treated Millbrook like their personal kingdom, and anyone who threatened their control." She trailed off, staring into her coffee. "Susan, what did your husband discover about the mill?" "That they'd been dumping chemical waste directly into the groundwater for years. Stuff that was supposed to be properly disposed of, but that cost money they didn't want to spend. Thomas found out that people in the bottoms were getting sick, and he knew it was because of the contamination." "How did he find out?" "He hired an environmental consultant on his own without telling the partners. When the test results came back showing dangerous levels of contamination, Thomas panicked. He knew what it meant. Lawsuits, criminal charges, the end of everything." James leaned forward. "But he was going to do the right thing anyway." Susan nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "He went to Pastor Williams because he didn't know who else he could trust. Pastor Williams was the only person in town who wasn't connected to the mill or beholden to the partners in some way." "What was the plan?" "Thomas was going to turn over all the evidence to the State Environmental Agency and the FBI. Pastor Williams was going to hold press conferences, make sure the community knew what had been done to them. They were going to demand proper medical care for the victims and criminal prosecution for the people responsible. But someone found out." Susan's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Thomas was so scared after he met with Pastor Williams that he told me everything. I begged him to just take the evidence and run, to get our family out of there before someone got hurt. But he said too many people had already suffered, that he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to make it right." "What happened the night Pastor Williams died?" "Mayor Caldwell and his lawyer came to our house. They said they knew about Thomas's meetings with the pastor, and they made it clear what would happen if the information went public. They threatened you. They threatened our children. Said that if Thomas couldn't keep Pastor Williams quiet, they would have to find another way, and that accidents could happen to anyone, even kids." James felt cold anger building in his chest. "Did your husband go to the church that night?" Susan nodded miserably. "He said he was going to try to convince Pastor Williams to wait, to give them time to work out some kind of deal, but I think he knew it wouldn't work. Pastor Williams wasn't the kind of man who could be bought or scared off." "Did Thomas tell you what happened at the church?" "He came home around 10:30, completely shattered. He said Pastor Williams was dead, that there had been an argument, and that everything had gone wrong." James leaned back in his seat, processing the implications. "Susan, are you telling me that your husband was present when Pastor Williams was killed?" "He said it was an accident, that Mayor Caldwell's man, some enforcer they'd brought in from Atlanta, had just meant to scare the pastor. But Pastor Williams fought back, and in the struggle—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "They killed him," James said quietly. "Thomas said they made it look like a heart attack, moved the body to make it seem like he'd collapsed while walking home. Then they told Thomas that if he ever said anything, they'd kill our whole family and make it look like accidents too. Justice at last." 3 days later, James stood in Judge Sarah Coleman's courtroom as Patricia arrested Mayor Caldwell on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, environmental crimes, and obstruction of justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Susan Morrison's testimony, the documents from the church basement, and financial records showing the systematic corruption that had plagued Millbrook for decades. Dr. Richard Caldwell was taken into custody the same day. Sheriff Hartwell had died 5 years earlier, but his estate faced civil liability for his role in the cover-up. The enforcer from Atlanta, identified through Susan's testimony as Vincent "Vinny" Torino, had died in prison in 2003 while serving time for unrelated crimes. But his death didn't diminish the weight of evidence against the surviving conspirators. As James watched the handcuffs close around Mayor Caldwell's wrists, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense that justice was still possible, even after decades of lies and cover-ups. 6 months later, James stood in the cemetery behind Mount Calvary Baptist Church, placing fresh flowers on Pastor Williams's grave. The headstone now bore the inscription, Truth Teller and Martyr, added after the church congregation voted unanimously to honor their murdered pastor. The environmental cleanup in the Bottoms had been accelerated, funded by settlements from the civil lawsuits that followed the criminal convictions. A scholarship fund had been established in Pastor Williams's name to help young people from the community attend college. Marcus Henderson, the teenager who had found the hidden box, was among the first recipients. James had resigned from the Atlanta Police Department and accepted an offer to serve as Millbrook's new sheriff, replacing Patricia, who had been elected to the state legislature on a platform of government transparency and environmental justice. On his desk in the sheriff's office, he kept Pastor Williams's wooden cross, not as a religious symbol, but as a reminder that sometimes the truth was worth any price, and that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. The faith that James had lost so many years ago hadn't fully returned, but something had taken its place, a deeper understanding of the difference between institutional religion and genuine spiritual conviction, and a renewed commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Pastor Williams had been right. The truth did eventually come out. It just took 18 years and a curious teenager to find it hidden in a church basement, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. As James walked back toward town, past the houses where families were finally breathing clean water for the first time in decades, he could almost hear Pastor Williams's voice on the evening breeze. "Well done, son, well done."